Everyone stopped when the billionaire arrived. Not because anyone told them to. Not because there was an announcement. It was instinct. Assistants mid-stride slowed without realizing it. Conversations thinned, then vanished, words swallowed by the quiet hum of polished floors and controlled air. A man reached for his phone and froze with it half lifted, as if remembering too late that nothing else mattered right now. Security straightened. Jackets were smoothed. A path cleared without anyone asking for it. This was how it always went. Ethan Cole walked through spaces the way storms moved through open land, inevitable, unquestioned, altering the air around him. At 46, he had built an empire that didn't need introductions. People recognized him without knowing his name. They felt him before they saw him. Money had that effect. So did power, when it was quiet enough. He moved forward without slowing, his steps measured, his expression neutral in the way men learn to wear after years of being watched. Airports, hospitals, boardrooms, it didn't matter. The reaction was always the same. People waited. Except this time, someone didn't. She stood near the edge of the marble corridor, just past the velvet rope meant to guide everyone else backward. She was small enough that most people missed her entirely. A little black girl, no more than 8, maybe 9. Her feet were planted firmly in worn sneakers that had been cleaned carefully, even if they could no longer be made new. She wasn't holding a phone. She wasn't tugging at anyone's sleeve. She simply stood where she was. Her hands were folded loosely in front of her, fingers laced the way children did when they were taught patience early. Her hair was braided neatly, the ends tied with faded beads that clicked softly when she shifted her weight. She wore a yellow dress that had been ironed with care, though the hem showed signs of many washings. She watched the man approaching her, not with fear, not with awe, but with focus. As if she had been waiting for him specifically. Everyone else had moved back by then. A woman whispered urgently to the child's grandmother, tugging at her elbow. A security guard took one step forward, already preparing a polite but firm instruction. This was a restricted path. This was not a place to linger. This was not. But the girl didn't hear any of that. Or perhaps she did, and it simply didn't register as important. She wasn't defiant. She wasn't brave. She just didn't know she was supposed to wait. Ethan Cole didn't see her at first. He was already thinking ahead. About the meeting that had ended 10 minutes earlier, about the call he still hadn't returned, about the tightness in his chest that had been appearing more frequently these days, usually late at night, when there was no one left to impress. His assistant murmured something behind him. Security adjusted their formation subtly, preparing to redirect foot traffic. That was when he noticed the stillness. Not the silence, he was used to that, but the wrongness of it. A space that hadn't moved. His stride shortened by half a step before he realized it. His gaze lowered, not sharply, not urgently, just enough for awareness to catch up with habit. And there she was. Directly in his path. Too close to ignore. Too calm to dismiss. For a fraction of a second, he assumed she would move. Everyone always did. It was the final, invisible rule of his life. But she didn't. Her eyes met his, not wide, not startled. Just steady. Dark and thoughtful in a way that didn't belong to someone her age. The kind of look that suggested she was measuring something, not reacting to it. The corridor held its breath. Security tensed. His assistant stopped walking altogether. Ethan Cole stopped too. Not because the child blocked him, there was room to step around her. Not because anyone asked him to. He stopped because something in the way she stood unsettled him. She wasn't waiting for permission. She wasn't asking for attention. She was present. And for reasons he couldn't name, that presence felt heavier than the room full of people who had spent years orbiting him. 1,000 interactions flickered through his mind, requests, negotiations, flattery, desperation. He had learned to read them all. Learned to anticipate what people wanted before they opened their mouths. But this child hadn't opened hers yet. She looked up at him, chin slightly raised, as if she had already decided he was worth speaking to. But only if he was willing to listen. Ethan hadn't felt this sensation in a long time. The sensation of being paused. Not interrupted. Not challenged. Paused. Behind him, someone cleared their throat softly. Ahead, the exit doors waited, wide and automatic, ready to open at his approach. But he didn't move. Because in that moment, standing in front of him, was a little black girl who hadn't stepped aside. And he had the sudden, uncomfortable feeling that if he walked past her now, he would be leaving something unfinished behind. And whatever she was about to say, he wasn't sure he was ready to hear it. Ethan Cole had learned to control rooms without touching anything in them. It came from years of practice, meetings where silence meant leverage, negotiations where patience decided the outcome before numbers ever did. He knew how long to hold eye contact, when to let it go. He knew when to speak last, and when not to speak at all. But standing there, with a little black girl looking up at him, he felt none of that control. Time stretched in a strange way. Not slow exactly, just suspended, like something fragile was balancing between 1 second and the next. She tilted her head slightly, studying him the way children sometimes studied adults when they were trying to decide whether the rules applied. "Sir," she said. Her voice was soft. Not shy. Just small. The sound of it traveled farther than it should have. Ethan blinked once, a reflex he couldn't stop. No one addressed him like that anymore. Not without titles. Not without rehearsed confidence or calculated warmth. "Sir," was what children said when they hadn't learned who you were supposed to be yet. "Yes," he heard himself answer. The word surprised him. It sounded less like authority and more like permission. She hesitated. Not because she was afraid, but because she was choosing her words carefully. Her eyes flicked briefly toward her grandmother, who stood a few steps back now, hands clasped tightly, torn between pride and panic. Then the girl looked back at him. "Do you always walk that fast?" she asked, "or only when you don't want people to talk to you?" The corridor didn't move. Ethan felt the question land before he understood it. It wasn't rude. It wasn't clever. It was observant. A few people behind him inhaled sharply, as if bracing for impact. His assistant's shoulders stiffened, already preparing to intervene, to smooth this moment over before it turned into something else. But Ethan raised a hand slightly, without looking back. The girl watched his hand, then his face again, waiting. No one had ever asked him that. Not in those words. Not without an angle. He could have laughed. He could have dismissed it with a smile, turned it into a joke about busy schedules and important meetings. He had done that 1,000 times before. Instead, he found himself thinking about how long it had been since he'd walked slowly anywhere. Airports were rushed. Offices were rushed. Even his own home had become a place of movement rather than rest. He moved through life as if stillness were a liability. "I suppose," he said carefully, "I'm usually in a hurry." She nodded, as if that confirmed something she'd already suspected. "Is it because," she continued, "people ask you for things?" There it was. The assumption everyone else made, but never stated so plainly. Ethan exhaled through his nose, the faintest hint of a smile tugging at the corner of his mouth before he caught it. "That does happen," he admitted. She considered this, her fingers tightening slightly where they were laced together. "My teacher says when people want a lot from you, you stop hearing what they're really saying." The words were too precise to belong entirely to a child. He glanced briefly at her grandmother, who flushed, shaking her head just enough to signal that this conversation had not been rehearsed. Whatever was happening here, it was genuine. "And do you think that's true?" Ethan asked. It felt strange to ask her opinion. Stranger still to realize he wanted it. She shrugged, a small movement. I think it makes you lonely. That did it. Something shifted, not visibly, not dramatically, but deeply enough that Ethan felt it in his chest. A quiet pressure, like the echo of a thought he'd avoided for years. Lonely. The word didn't fit the life he lived. He was surrounded constantly, by staff, by colleagues, by people who wanted to be near him simply because of what proximity promised. And yet, he thought of the dinners eaten alone. The phone calls returned out of obligation, not desire. The way silence followed him from room to room once the doors closed. He realized, suddenly, that this child was not waiting for his answer. She wasn't testing him. She was telling him something. Why did you stop? She asked then, her voice lowering just a fraction. Most people don't. Ethan opened his mouth, then closed it again. He could have said the truth, that he didn't know. That something about the way she stood there, unmoved by his presence, had unsettled him. That for the first time in a long while, someone hadn't treated him like a destination to reach or avoid. Instead, he said, I think. I wanted to hear the rest. Her face softened, not into a smile, but into relief. Good, she said simply. Because I have one more thing. Behind them, the doors slid open with a quiet hiss, the exit finally responding to his proximity. Outside, cars waited. Schedules waited. An entire world resumed its pull. But Ethan didn't turn. He crouched slightly then. Not fully, not dramatically, just enough to bring himself closer to her level, an unconscious gesture that sent a ripple through everyone watching. What is it? He asked. She took a breath. And the way she looked at him before she spoke made him understand that whatever came next was not a request. It was a truth. The little girl didn't speak right away. She looked down at her shoes, scuffed at the toes but carefully tied, as if she were checking something only she could see. The pause wasn't nervous. It was deliberate. The kind of pause that came from knowing words mattered, even if you didn't yet know why. Ethan stayed where he was. He didn't straighten. He didn't glance at his watch. Behind him, his assistant shifted weight from one foot to the other. A security guard lowered his chin slightly, eyes scanning the corridor, alert but unsure what exactly he was protecting now. The world that usually bent around Ethan Cole didn't know how to behave when he wasn't moving forward. The girl lifted her head again. My grandma says, she began, then stopped. She frowned, reconsidering. She says people don't listen when you talk at them. Ethan nodded once. She sounds wise. She is, the girl said immediately, with quiet certainty. Then, after a beat, but this isn't something she told me to say. That mattered. Ethan felt it settle in his chest like a weight he hadn't agreed to carry, but somehow already was. She clasped her hands tighter, knuckles whitening just slightly. I saw you last week. He searched his memory quickly, events, places, faces. Nothing surfaced. Here, she clarified. In this same hallway. He nodded again. I'm here often. You were talking to a man, she said. He kept nodding like this. She demonstrated, bobbing her head repeatedly, exaggerated just enough to be accurate. But he didn't look happy. Ethan exhaled softly. He knew the type. He looked scared, she added. Like when kids nod because they don't want to get in trouble. A faint, humorless smile touched Ethan's mouth and vanished just as quickly. And what made you notice that? He asked. She shrugged. Because I do that sometimes. That landed harder than anything else she'd said. Ethan studied her more carefully now, not just her face, but the way she held herself. The stillness. The way she didn't fidget unless she chose to. This was a child who had learned early how to take up as little space as possible. What happens when you do? He asked. She hesitated again, but only for a second. Usually nothing, she said. People think I agree. But I don't. He felt a tightening behind his ribs. And does that bother you? She thought about it. Really thought. Sometimes, she admitted. But sometimes it keeps things peaceful. Peaceful. Another word that didn't mean what people thought it meant. Ethan leaned back slightly on his heels, absorbing that. He had built an empire on people nodding when they didn't agree. On meetings that stayed peaceful because truth was inconvenient. So, she continued, looking up at him again, I wanted to ask you something. Here it was. The real reason she hadn't moved. The reason she had waited without waiting. Yes, he said quietly. She swallowed once. When people nod at you like that. Do you know when they don't mean it? The corridor felt smaller. Ethan didn't answer immediately. He thought of the man from last week. The careful nods. The forced smiles. The contract that had been signed anyway. He thought of how often he had mistaken silence for agreement because it made things easier. I think, he said slowly, I've gotten very good at pretending I don't notice. She nodded, not in agreement, but in recognition. That's what my grandma does sometimes, she said. When grown-ups are arguing. Ethan's gaze flicked to the woman standing behind her. The grandmother's eyes were glossy now, her mouth pressed tight, as if she were holding back words she'd learned long ago not to speak out loud. The girl followed his glance, then looked back at him. She says pretending is a kind of protection. Yes, Ethan said. The word came out rougher than he expected. It is. They stood there like that, an unlikely triangle of generations and silence. Until the girl shifted her feet. I think, she said carefully, that if people are always pretending with you, they don't really get to know you. There it was. Not an accusation. Not a judgment. An observation. Ethan felt something in him resist it automatically. The part that had survived long enough to build what he had built. The part that whispered this is the cost. But another part, quieter, older, recognized the truth of it immediately. And why does that matter? He asked, though he already knew. She looked up at him with that same steady focus as before. Because if no one knows you, she said, they won't tell you when you're wrong. The air shifted. Ethan straightened slowly, not because he wanted distance, but because the weight of the moment demanded it. He hadn't been spoken to like this in decades, not with honesty that didn't want anything in return. Around them, people waited. For him to laugh. For him to move on. For this moment to end. But Ethan Cole stood very still. And for the first time in a long while, he wondered how many times he had mistaken being followed, for being understood. Ethan Cole had always believed clarity came from decisiveness. From knowing what you wanted and moving toward it without hesitation. It was how deals closed. How companies grew. How people learned not to waste his time. Standing there now, he felt the flaw in that belief for the first time. Not because the girl had challenged him. But because she hadn't. She wasn't trying to change his mind. She wasn't trying to teach him a lesson. She had simply held up a quiet mirror and stepped aside, letting him decide whether to look. He took a slow breath. Around them, the corridor remained frozen in a kind of respectful confusion. People pretended to check their phones. A man adjusted his tie twice. No one spoke. The girl shifted her weight again, the beads at the end of her braids clicking softly. I'm not saying you're wrong, she added, as if sensing the direction of his thoughts. I just wanted to know if you noticed. Ethan studied her face, the earnestness, the absence of expectation. Most people asked questions like traps, designed to snap shut around the answer. This one felt like an open door. I notice more than I let on, he said finally. She accepted that without comment. But, he continued, surprising himself by continuing at all, there's a difference between noticing and stopping. Her brow furrowed slightly. Why wouldn't you stop? He almost laughed. Almost. Because stopping meant delays. Delays meant vulnerability. Vulnerability meant losing the edge that had taken him decades to sharpen. Because stopping meant letting people close enough to disappoint you. Because stopping meant acknowledging that the silence around him wasn't peace, it was distance. Instead of saying any of that, he said, because people rely on me to keep moving. The girl considered this, then nodded once. People rely on my grandma too, she said. That's why she doesn't cry when she's tired. Ethan's gaze flicked back to the grandmother again. The woman's eyes dropped immediately, as if she'd been caught doing something she wasn't supposed to, feeling seen. That's a heavy thing, he said quietly. It is, the girl agreed. But sometimes I wish she would. Why? So I could help. The simplicity of it struck him harder than any accusation could have. Ethan felt something loosen in his chest, a tension he hadn't realized he carried everywhere. How many people around him felt the same way? How many were waiting, silently, for him to slow down enough to let them in? He straightened fully now, not to end the moment, but to include it. To make space for it. You know, he said, choosing his words carefully, most people don't ask questions like that. She tilted her head. Why not? Because, he said, they're afraid of the answers. She frowned. That doesn't make sense. If you don't ask, you still have the answer. You just don't know it. He let out a breath that might have been a laugh if it hadn't sounded so tired. You're right, he said. Her face brightened, not with pride, but with relief, as if she'd been worried she was wrong. From behind them came a soft but insistent cough. Ethan's assistant stepped forward half a pace, lowering his voice. Mr. Cole, the car is ready. Ethan didn't look back. Thank you, he said calmly. I know. The assistant hesitated, then stepped back again. The message was clear enough, the schedule could wait. The girl glanced toward the exit doors, then back up at him. Are you going now? Eventually, he said. She nodded, satisfied. Okay. There was something about that, her acceptance of his answer without trying to control it, that unsettled him all over again. He realized then that she hadn't stopped him to make him stay. She had stopped him to make him think. What's your name? He asked. She hesitated, just for a beat. Amani. It suits you, he said. And he meant it. Amani smiled faintly, not the wide, eager kind adults expected from children, but something smaller. Something reserved. My grandma says names are like promises, she said. You grow into them. Ethan nodded. That's a good way to think about it. A pause settled between them. Not awkward. Just full. Can I ask you something else? She said. He didn't answer right away. He felt the weight of the question, not the words themselves, but the fact that she trusted him enough to ask again. Yes, he said. You can. Amani drew in a breath, steadying herself. If people are always agreeing with you, how do you know when to change? The question hit deeper than the others. This wasn't about loneliness now. This was about accountability. Ethan felt the familiar instinct rise, the urge to deflect, to intellectualize, to turn this into a philosophical discussion he could win. Instead, he did something far more dangerous. He answered honestly. I don't, he said. Not always. She absorbed that, her expression thoughtful. That sounds hard. It is, he agreed. She nodded again, then glanced at her grandmother. We should go, she said softly. The grandmother stepped forward, relief and regret mingling on her face. "Thank you for your patience," she said to Ethan, voice tight. He shook his head. "No," he said. "Thank you." As they turned to leave, Amani paused. She looked back at him one last time. "I hope," she said, "someone tells you when you're wrong today." Then she walked away. Ethan Cole stood there long after they disappeared into the crowd. For the first time in years, he didn't feel delayed. He felt redirected. Ethan Cole eventually did walk through the doors. They slid open the way they always did, smooth, obedient, automatic. Outside, the car waited exactly where it was supposed to. The driver stood ready, posture straight, eyes forward. The world resumed its choreography the moment Ethan stepped into it. But something was off. He settled into the back seat, the leather cool beneath his palms. The door closed with a quiet, final thud. His assistant slid in beside him, already mid-sentence. "We were able to move the call with Zurich to later this afternoon," he said, tapping his tablet. "Legal sent over the revised figures, N." "Stop," Ethan said. The word wasn't sharp. It wasn't angry. It was tired. The assistant froze, then nodded quickly. Silence filled the car, punctuated only by the soft hum of the engine pulling away from the curb. Ethan leaned his head back, eyes drifting shut, not to rest, but to think. If people are always agreeing with you, how do you know when to change? The question replayed itself with an annoying clarity, as if his mind had latched onto it and refused to let go. He had spent years believing change was something he initiated, strategically, intentionally, always on his terms. But what if that wasn't true? What if change had been trying to get his attention for a long time? And he'd simply been walking too fast to notice. "Did you need something else, sir?" the assistant asked carefully. Ethan opened his eyes. "How did the man from last week take the revision?" he asked. The assistant blinked, scrolling back through his notes. "He accepted it. Signed without objection." Ethan nodded slowly. Did he hesitate? There was a pause. Briefly. Yes. Did he say anything? No, the assistant replied. But he seemed relieved once it was over. Relieved. Ethan stared out the window as the city blurred past. Relieved didn't mean satisfied. It meant finished. It meant done enduring something you hadn't wanted to push back against. That wasn't a good deal for him, Ethan said. The assistant hesitated. It was within acceptable margins. That's not what I asked. No, the assistant admitted. It wasn't. The silence returned, thicker now. Ethan felt the old instinct rise again. This is how it works. People agreed because it was easier. Because resistance came at a cost. Because power, when it stayed unchecked, taught everyone around it to nod. Amani had known that without ever learning the word for it. Schedule a follow-up, Ethan said. With him. The assistant looked up. Sir. I want to hear what he didn't say. The assistant nodded slowly, a flicker of uncertainty crossing his face. I'll arrange it. The car turned onto a quieter street. Ethan's reflection stared back at him from the tinted glass. Older than he felt, more guarded than he remembered becoming. For the first time in a long while, he wondered how many versions of himself existed in other people's silences. That evening, Ethan found himself standing in the doorway of his penthouse, briefcase still in hand. The lights were on, but the space felt hollow. Too clean. Too quiet. He had designed it that way, no clutter, no reminders, nothing that stayed longer than it was useful. He set the briefcase down without opening it. Instead, he walked to the window. The city stretched below him, endless and alive. Thousands of people moving at once, each carrying thoughts, worries, truths they might never speak aloud. He thought of Amani's grandmother. Of the way her eyes had dropped when he looked at her. Of the kind of strength that came from swallowing yourself for the sake of others. Pretending is a kind of protection. He had built an empire on that same principle. His phone buzzed once on the counter. A message from the foundation director he barely remembered appointing. We received another letter today. No return address. Handwritten. It's about the school grant. Ethan frowned. Read it to me, he said into the phone. There was a pause, then the voice on the other end continued, uncertain. It's unusual. Not a request. More like a question. Ethan felt a quiet, unexpected tightening in his chest. What does it say? Another pause. Longer this time. It says, the director read slowly, if you help us, will you still listen when we tell you what didn't work? Ethan closed his eyes. For a moment, he saw a little girl in a yellow dress, standing in a marble corridor, refusing to move, not out of defiance, but out of honesty. Send me the full file, he said. After the call ended, Ethan remained by the window, the city lights reflecting in his eyes. He realized something then, something small, but unsettling. Amani hadn't changed him. She had only made it impossible for him to keep pretending nothing needed to. And that was far more dangerous. Because once you noticed the silences around you, you had to decide what to do with them. Ethan picked up his phone again, scrolling through contacts he rarely used. Names that represented people he'd outgrown, or outpaced, or simply stopped listening to. He stopped on one. He hadn't called this person in years. His thumb hovered. Then he pressed call. The line rang. And for the first time in a long while, Ethan Cole waited. The call connected on the fourth ring. Ethan, the voice said, surprised. Is everything okay? He closed his eyes briefly at the sound of it. Familiar. Grounded. Not impressed by him anymore, if it ever had been. Yes, he said. I think so. I just needed to ask you something. There was a pause on the other end. That's new. Ethan almost smiled. That's what I'm afraid of. They spoke for only a few minutes. Nothing dramatic, no confessions. Just a question here, a memory there. A space reopened that he hadn't realized he'd sealed shut years ago. When the call ended, the penthouse felt different. Not warmer. Just less hollow. The next morning, the effect followed him into the office. It began subtly. In the executive meeting, the numbers were presented as they always were, clean slides, confident delivery, conclusions drawn before dissent could form. Ethan listened without interrupting, hands folded loosely in front of him. When the presentation ended, the room waited. Normally, this was where he spoke. Where he affirmed the direction and everyone exhaled in relief. Instead, he asked, what concerns you about this? The room didn't answer. People shifted in their seats. Someone cleared their throat. A woman glanced sideways at her colleague, silently asking whether he would speak first. I asked, Ethan repeated, gently, what concerns you? A long moment passed before someone finally said, the timeline is aggressive. Ethan nodded. What happens if it slips? Another pause. We'll need to cut corners. Which ones? No one answered this time. Ethan felt it clearly then, the resistance. Not to the plan, but to the act of speaking honestly in front of him. This wasn't fear of consequences. It was habit. Silence had worked for too long to abandon easily. Let's stop, Ethan said quietly. The word rippled through the room. We're not moving forward on this today, he continued. I want written feedback. Real feedback. If something feels wrong, say why. A man across the table frowned. Sir, if we slow down now. I know exactly what slowing down costs, Ethan said, meeting his eyes. What I'm asking is what moving too fast has been costing us. The meeting ended differently than it began, no clear resolution, no clean conclusion. As people filed out, conversations buzzed in low, uncertain tones. Change had a sound, Ethan realized. It sounded like discomfort. By mid-afternoon, the pushback became visible. His assistant stood in the doorway of his office, expression carefully neutral. "There's concern," he said. "From who?" "Several departments. They're confused by the new direction." Ethan leaned back in his chair. "Confused how?" "They're worried that inviting dissent will slow decision-making. That it could be interpreted as weakness." Ethan considered that. All those years, he had worn certainty like armor. He had confused decisiveness with strength, speed with clarity. And in doing so, he had trained everyone around him to protect him from doubt. "Tell them this," Ethan said. "Listening doesn't make us weaker. It just makes us more accurate." The assistant nodded, though his expression suggested he wasn't entirely convinced. Later that day, the man from the previous week, the one who had nodded through a bad deal, sat across from Ethan again. This time, there were no slides. "Tell me what you didn't say last time," Ethan said. The man hesitated. Old instincts surfaced. Then, slowly, something shifted. The terms were survivable, he admitted. But not sustainable. "I didn't think you'd want to hear that." "Why not?" "Because no one ever has." Ethan felt the weight of that, not as an accusation, but as a consequence. "Tell me now," he said. And the man did. The conversation took longer than planned. It was messy. But when it ended, both of them looked relieved, not victorious, not defeated. Just, heard. As the man left, Ethan sat alone in the conference room, staring at the empty chair across from him. "If no one knows you," Amani had said, "they won't tell you when you're wrong." For the first time, someone had. That evening, as Ethan prepared to leave, he noticed something waiting on his desk. An envelope. Plain. Cream-colored. Handwritten address. He recognized the careful, looping script immediately. Inside was a single page. "My granddaughter asked me if powerful people ever get lonely. I didn't know how to answer her. Thank you for stopping." There was no signature. Ethan folded the letter slowly and placed it back in the envelope. In that moment, something settled, not into certainty, but into responsibility. Stopping once was easy. Stopping again, when it cost him something, would be the real test. He turned off the lights and left the office. But this time, he didn't walk as fast. The first article appeared 3 days later. It wasn't dramatic. No headlines about upheaval or scandal. Just a quiet business column noting that coal industries had delayed a major rollout, citing internal review and stakeholder feedback. Ethan read it once. Then again. Delays used to make him uneasy. They felt like weakness, like hesitation bleeding into public view. But this time, the discomfort came from somewhere else. From knowing the delay was intentional. His phone rang before he finished his coffee. "Ethan," said a familiar voice. "Everything all right over there?" It was one of the board members. Old guard. The kind who valued predictability above all else. "Fine," Ethan replied. "Why?" "There's talk," the man said carefully. "People are surprised." Ethan smiled faintly. People are always surprised when things change. "Yes," the board member said. "That's usually why they resist it." After the call ended, Ethan stood at the window of his kitchen, watching the city wake up. He thought of Amani again, not her words this time, but her posture. The way she had stood still while everything else moved. By the time he reached the office, the atmosphere had shifted. Not loudly. Not openly. But conversations stopped a beat later than usual when he entered rooms. Eyes lingered longer. People weren't sure which version of him they were dealing with, the man who decided quickly and alone, or the one who asked questions and waited for answers. In a smaller meeting that afternoon, a junior analyst spoke up. "I'm not sure this assumption holds," she said, voice steady but careful. Ethan turned toward her fully. "Tell me more." The room stiffened. But she did. Her analysis wasn't perfect. She stumbled once, corrected herself, then continued. When she finished, she looked almost embarrassed, as if she'd overstepped. Ethan nodded. "Thank you." That was all. But it was enough. Later, she would tell someone she hadn't slept the night before, afraid she'd be reprimanded. Instead, she'd been listened to. That story would travel farther than any memo. The resistance came more quietly. Emails with polite concern. Advisors reminding him of market expectations. A consultant suggesting he might want to reassure stakeholders that he was still decisive. Ethan listened. He always had. But now he listened differently. "What are you actually worried about?" he asked one of them. The man hesitated. Then sighed. "That if people realize they can slow you down, they'll try to." Ethan leaned back in his chair. "And if they realize I'm listening? They'll test it." "Good," Ethan said. "That means they're thinking." Not everyone agreed. By the end of the week, one executive requested a private meeting. "This isn't what we signed up for," the man said bluntly. "Your speed was the advantage. You're changing the rules." Ethan nodded. "I am. And if it costs us?" "It already has," Ethan replied calmly. "We just didn't count it before." The executive left unconvinced. Ethan didn't stop him. That evening, Ethan found himself at a small park near his building. He hadn't planned it. His driver had offered to take the long way around due to traffic, and Ethan had asked him to stop instead. Children played near the swings, their laughter loose and unfiltered. Parents watched from benches, phones forgotten in their laps. Ethan sat down, hands folded, unnoticed. He watched a little girl stand at the edge of the playground, waiting, not because she was told to, but because she was deciding. When she moved, it was on her own terms. Ethan felt a quiet smile form. Change, he realized, didn't announce itself. It showed up in small hesitations. In questions asked aloud. In people choosing not to nod automatically anymore. His phone buzzed. A message from the foundation director. "We heard back from the school. They want to revise the program. They say parts of it won't work for their students." Ethan typed back immediately. "Good. Set up a meeting. I want to hear why." He slipped the phone back into his pocket and watched the children play. For the first time, slowing down didn't feel like risk. It felt like alignment. And somewhere across the city, a little black girl in a yellow dress was doing her homework at a kitchen table, unaware that the way she had stood still had begun to teach a powerful man, and everyone around him, how to move differently. The invitation arrived sealed, embossed, impossible to ignore. A national education summit. Cameras. Donors. Policy leaders. A room full of people who expected Ethan Cole to speak the way he always had, confident, concise, untouchable. He stood backstage, jacket perfectly tailored, notes resting untouched on the podium. "You have 8 minutes," the event coordinator whispered. 5 if you want applause." Ethan nodded, though his attention was elsewhere. Through the curtains, he could see the audience settling. Faces turned toward the stage with practiced interest. This was familiar territory. He had stood in rooms like this his entire adult life. But this time, something felt different. He hadn't prepared a speech. Not really. The foundation team had sent him drafts, strong ones. Metrics. Outcomes. A narrative of success that would reassure everyone that coal industry still knew exactly where it was going. He had read them. Then he'd closed the folder. When his name was announced, the applause rose immediately, loud, automatic, earned more by reputation than presence. Ethan stepped into the light. He waited. Not for the applause to fade, though it did, but for himself. "Thank you," he said, voice calm, measured. "I was told I should speak for 5 minutes." A ripple of polite laughter. "I'm going to take 8, he continued. "And I'm not going to tell you what's working." The room stilled. Ethan felt it, the collective shift, the recalibration of expectations. "I want to talk about what hasn't." He paused. Not for effect. For honesty. "Recently," he said, "a child asked me how I know when to change, if everyone agrees with me." A murmur moved through the crowd. This wasn't on the program. She wasn't asking for funding, Ethan continued. She wasn't asking for help. She was asking about listening. Somewhere in the audience, a pen stopped moving. "I've spent years believing progress meant speed," he said. That clarity meant certainty. That silence meant alignment. He looked out over the room. Over the donors, the decision-makers, the people whose approval had once felt essential. "I was wrong." The word landed heavier than any statistic could have. "You don't improve systems by protecting leaders from discomfort," Ethan said. "You improve them by letting truth reach them, even when it slows everything down." No applause. Just attention. "We've funded programs that looked good on paper and failed quietly in practice," he continued. "Because we didn't listen when the people closest to the problem told us what wasn't working." He took a breath. "That ends now." Cameras captured the moment. Not the kind that went viral for drama, but the kind that lingered, archived, referenced later. "I'm asking our partners," Ethan said, "to stop nodding politely. Tell us when we're wrong. Tell us what we missed. Tell us what we need to change." He stepped back from the podium slightly. "And if that costs us time, comfort, or control, so be it." For a heartbeat, the room remained silent. Then, slowly, someone began to clap. Not loudly. Honestly. The applause spread, uneven at first, then steady. Backstage, the coordinator stared at him. That wasn't in the script. Ethan smiled faintly. "I know." That evening, the responses poured in. Emails from educators. Notes from partners who admitted they'd wanted to speak up for years. Messages that didn't praise him, but thanked him. The board called an emergency session. "This will change expectations," one member warned. Ethan nodded. "That's the point." When the call ended, Ethan sat alone in his office, the city dark beyond the glass. He thought of a marble hallway. Of a child who hadn't waited. Of how easy it would have been to keep walking. His phone buzzed once more. A message from the foundation director. "We heard back from the school again. They want to bring students to the next meeting. They say the kids have opinions too." Ethan stared at the screen for a long moment. Then he typed. "Make room for them." He set the phone down and leaned back in his chair. Silence surrounded him, but this time, it wasn't agreement. It was possibility. The backlash didn't come from the places Ethan expected. It wasn't the public. It wasn't the educators or the students or the partners who had finally been invited into the conversation. It came from inside. The board meeting was tense from the start. No small talk. No easing in. "You put us in a difficult position," one member said flatly, fingers steepled on the table. Ethan nodded. "I know." "You publicly admitted fault," another added. "You invited criticism. That changes how we're perceived." "Yes," Ethan said again. A third voice cut in. We built this foundation on clarity and confidence. Not uncertainty. Ethan leaned forward slightly. We built it on results. And some of those results haven't been what we claimed. Silence fell. You're asking us, the first member said carefully, to accept slower growth. More negotiation. Less control. Ethan met his gaze. I'm asking you to accept reality. One of them exhaled sharply. This could cost us donors. It already has, Ethan replied. 2 pulled out this morning. That landed. The room shifted, irritation edging into something sharper, fear. You see, someone said. This is exactly. I know, Ethan interrupted, calm but firm. Listening isn't free. It never was. He let that sit. For years, he continued, we paid the cost elsewhere. In failed programs. In quiet frustration. In people who stopped telling us the truth because it didn't seem to matter. A pause. I'm choosing to pay the cost up front now. The meeting ended without consensus. That alone was unprecedented. Later that afternoon, Ethan stood in the same marble corridor where it had begun. He hadn't planned to be there. The meeting location had been chosen by someone else, a coincidence that felt heavier than it should have. The corridor looked unchanged, polished floors, soft lighting, controlled quiet. But Ethan wasn't the same man who had walked through it days earlier. He slowed as he reached the spot. There was no sign marking it. No plaque. Just empty space. And yet, he could see her clearly. Small. Still. Refusing to move. He wondered if she ever realized what she had done. Or if to her, it had been nothing more than a question asked at the right moment. His phone buzzed. A text from his assistant. We lost another donor. They said they're not comfortable with the new direction. Ethan closed his eyes briefly. Comfort. How much of his life had been built around protecting the comfort of people who already had power? He typed back. Thank them for their support. Keep moving forward. He slipped the phone into his pocket and continued down the corridor. Slowly this time, deliberately. That evening, Ethan received an email forwarded from the foundation office. Subject line, Student Advisory Meeting. He opened it. The school had sent a list of names. At the bottom, a short note. One of our students asked if she could attend even though she's not officially on the council yet. She said she has something important to ask. Ethan's breath caught. He stared at the message, heart beating just a little faster. He didn't know her last name. He didn't know if it was the same child. But he knew. He replied with one line. Yes. Please tell her she doesn't have to wait. When he set the phone down, the cost of his choices pressed in on him, lost money, strained relationships, uncertainty ahead. But beneath it all was something steadier. A sense that for the first time, the silence around him was honest. An honest silence, he was learning, was worth far more than agreement that cost nothing. The conference room wasn't large. That surprised Ethan. He had expected something grander, rows of chairs, microphones, formality. Instead, there was a long wooden table, sunlight spilling in through wide windows, and a scattering of notebooks and water bottles that made the space feel more like a classroom than a boardroom. Students sat along one side of the table. Not many. 8, maybe 9. Different ages. Different postures. Some leaning forward, eager. Others sitting back, guarded. A few pretending not to be nervous while clearly being exactly that. Ethan took his seat across from them. For the first time in his career, he wasn't the most important person in the room. An educator began to speak, offering context, expectations, ground rules. Ethan listened politely, but his attention drifted toward the far end of the table. She sat there quietly. Yellow dress. Neatly braided hair. Hands folded just as he remembered. Amani. She met his eyes. Not with surprise, not with triumph, but with recognition. As if this was simply the next part of a conversation they had already started. Ethan felt a strange tightening in his throat. When the introductions ended, the educator smiled nervously. "We'll start by asking if anyone has questions." The room hesitated. Amani raised her hand halfway, not straight up, not timid. "Just enough." "Yes," the educator said. She looked at Ethan before speaking. "You said you wanted people to tell you when things don't work." "I did," Ethan replied. She nodded. "Okay." She glanced down at a piece of paper in front of her, then back up again. "The program you helped with last year gave us new computers," she said. "But they don't help if we don't have enough teachers." The room went still. Ethan didn't interrupt. "We had to share them," she continued, voice steady. "So the kids who needed help the most didn't get much time. And when they broke, no one fixed them." She paused. "Everyone kept saying thank you," she added. But nothing changed. A quiet murmur moved through the room, not disagreement, but recognition. Ethan felt the full weight of it then. Not the failure itself, but the fact that a child had noticed the gap between intention and impact long before any report ever had. "Why didn't anyone say something?" he asked. Amani shrugged. "We thought you wouldn't want to hear it." The words landed cleanly. No blame. Just truth. Ethan nodded slowly. "I did want to hear it," he said. "I just didn't know how to make space for it." She studied him for a moment. "Are you making space now?" "Yes," he said. "I am." She considered that. Then she asked the question that mattered most. "If we tell you again next year," she said, "and it still doesn't work, will you listen again?" Ethan didn't answer right away. The board would hear about this meeting. Donors would scrutinize the outcomes. Change would remain slow, uncomfortable, expensive. But this was the moment that would decide whether any of it meant anything. "Yes," he said. "Even if it costs me." Amani nodded. "Okay," she said. "Then I think it might work someday." The meeting continued after that, other students speaking, other issues raised. But Ethan felt something settle into place. This wasn't about fixing everything. It was about staying. When the session ended, students gathered their things, laughter creeping back into their voices as tension released. Amani lingered. "Sir," she said. Ethan turned. "Yes." "You walk slower now," she observed. He smiled, not proudly, not defensively. Just honestly. "I'm trying." She nodded once. Satisfied. Then she walked out of the room, disappearing into the hallway like she had the first time, without ceremony, without waiting. Ethan remained seated for a moment after everyone else had gone. For the first time in his life, he understood something clearly. The most powerful changes didn't begin with answers. They began with listening, again, and again, and again. The building emptied slowly. Students left in clusters, voices rising as the weight of being listened to lifted from their shoulders. Teachers followed, quiet but thoughtful. The foundation staff lingered, gathering notes, exchanging glances that said this felt different without quite knowing why. Ethan stayed where he was. The chair across from him, Amani's chair, sat empty now, pushed in neatly. A yellow ribbon from her dress had brushed against its edge when she stood. The smallest detail, already fading. He realized then that moments like this didn't echo loudly. They settled. Ethan had built a life chasing echoes, applause, approval, momentum. This felt quieter than all of that. But it reached deeper. The board meeting that followed was restrained. No shouting. No ultimatums. Just careful words. "You're changing the foundation's identity," one member said. Not angry. Just stating fact. "Yes," Ethan replied. "And if this fails?" Ethan didn't hesitate. "Then we'll know why." That answer unsettled them more than any defense could have. "What if donors don't return?" another asked. "Then we build slower," Ethan said. "But better." They didn't vote. They adjourned. That alone felt like progress. Later that evening, Ethan returned home and did something he hadn't done in years. He opened a drawer he rarely touched. Inside were things he'd outgrown but never thrown away: old business cards, a watch he no longer wore, a folded letter from his early 20s. He hadn't read it in decades. He unfolded it now. It was from his mother. "Don't become someone people are afraid to be honest with. Power doesn't change who you are, it reveals who you protect." Ethan sat with that for a long time. He wondered how many people had tried to tell him the same thing in quieter ways. How many he'd walked past because he was moving too fast. He thought of Amani. Of how she hadn't asked for money. Hadn't asked for help. Hadn't even asked him to change. She had only asked him to listen. And he had, once. The real test would be whether he kept listening when it stopped being new. When it stopped being admirable. When it became inconvenient again. His phone buzzed. A message from the foundation director. "The students want to come back next quarter. They want to track what changes and what doesn't." Ethan typed back. "Good. Let's track it together." He set the phone down and leaned back, staring at the ceiling. For the first time in years, the future didn't feel like something he had to outrun. It felt like something he could walk into. If this story touched something quiet in you, if it reminded you of a time you wanted to speak but didn't, please subscribe to Beat Stories HQ and tell me where you're watching from. Sometimes the smallest voices change the biggest rooms. And sometimes, they're just waiting for someone to stop. Months later, no one talked about the summit anymore. That was how real change worked. It stopped being a moment and became a habit. Coal industries moved differently now. Not slower in every way. Just, more carefully. Meetings ended without conclusions sometimes. Feedback arrived that wasn't flattering. Programs were revised midstream, not announced with fanfare but adjusted with humility. Some donors never returned. Others did, different ones. Quieter ones. People who cared less about having their names attached to success and more about knowing when something wasn't working. Ethan learned to live with that. On a cool afternoon in early spring, he found himself back in the marble corridor again. Not by accident this time. He walked it alone, hands in his coat pockets, steps unhurried. No entourage. No schedule pressing at his back. The space felt different when you weren't rushing through it. He stopped where it had all begun. The spot looked smaller than he remembered. He smiled faintly at that. A child passed by with her father, skipping to keep up. She looked up at Ethan briefly, curious, then kept moving. The world didn't pause for him anymore. And that was fine. That evening, Ethan attended a small school presentation, no press, no donors. Just students sharing what they'd learned, what had changed, and what still hadn't. Amani stood at the front of the room, holding a piece of paper she barely glanced at. "Our class learned," she said, "that sometimes grown-ups want to help, but they don't know how to hear us." Ethan sat in the back row, unnoticed. She continued, "We learned that asking questions is scary. But not asking them doesn't make things better." She looked up then, not searching, just speaking. "And we learned that when someone listens once, it matters. But when they listen again, that's when things start to change." Applause filled the room, not loud, not polished. Real. Ethan clapped too, his hands steady. When the room emptied, Amani walked past him. She didn't stop. She didn't need to. As she passed, she said softly, "You're still walking slower." Ethan smiled. "So are you." She considered that, then nodded and ran to catch her grandmother. Later that night, Ethan wrote a single line in a notebook he kept now, not for ideas or strategies, but for reminders. Power isn't proven by how many people wait on you. It's proven by who you're willing to wait for. He closed the notebook and turned off the light. Outside, the city moved at its usual pace. Inside, for the first time in his life, Ethan Cole felt no urgency to keep up. Only the responsibility to keep listening. If this story stayed with you, if it reminded you that listening is a choice, not a weakness, please subscribe to Beat Stories HQ, and tell me where you're watching from. Your voice matters more than you think. And sometimes, all it takes to change everything is refusing to wait.